Ryan, I'm really excited about this monologue that you've written. What have you got for us?
All right, so yesterday, Crystal talked about the way that revulsion at the ongoing slaughter in Gaza may have played a role in shaping how and whether people voted for Kamala Harris. As she described it, for many people, it is not exactly a straight line from "I oppose this genocide" to "I'm not voting for Kamala," but I think she's right in saying that it effectively colors the way you see the other arguments made on Kamala's behalf through a different prism. You need the moral high ground if you're going to run a campaign based around democracy and morality, and it's reasonable for people to conclude that killing tens of thousands of women and children means you've ceded a bit of that moral high ground. I think her point is a correct one, and you can actually take it even further, which I do in a new piece over at Dropsite News. I'll put a link in the description, and here's a reminder to sign up for our newsletter at dropsitenews.com. Now, in her monologue, which I'll also link down in the description, Crystal accurately noted that very few voters say they made their decisions based on foreign policy, something like 4% or so. But to many voters, the time, energy, and money that politicians spend on foreign wars stands in as a proxy for their lack of concern for people here at home. At the same time, the 4 years of the Biden administration saw a disconcerting outbreak of violence around the world. Trump himself is a mercurial and unpredictable figure, whereas Biden is even-keeled, at least in public. Yet Biden's 4 years were a bumpy ride of chaos, fueled significantly by the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Sharing the campaign stage down the stretch with Liz Cheney was a signal to voters that Democrats felt the cost of those wars was worth it, and that we'd get more of the same in a Harris administration. In the post-mortem so far, the Democratic Party's embrace of a more, quote, muscular foreign policy, as they like to call it, has almost entirely escaped notice. But it didn't escape the eye of voters. In mid-October, as Kamala Harris began to do interviews with friendly audiences, she visited the breakfast studio of radio host Charlemagne the God, where she took questions from callers. The first to come through was one of those questions that is often top of mind for voters, but dismissed in Washington as a naive misunderstanding of how the world truly works.
Go to the talkback feature.
My question for Kamala is, why are we, and I say we because my tax dollars is sending the money, why are we sending money to other countries when we desperately need it in our own country for homeless, housing, resources, for whatever? That is my determining factor if I vote for Kamala or not.
That's one of the reasons the America First rhetoric resonates, because nobody in America would complain about where money was going if American citizens' everyday needs were being met. So what do you say to that?
We can do it all, and we do. So first of all, I maintain very strongly America should never pull ourselves away from our responsibility as a world leader.
So interestingly, this was all a callback to the debate in Washington the last time a Democratic president had pushed through a sweeping new social spending agenda, LBJ's Great Society, but coupled it with ramped up spending on the Vietnam War. At a press conference in the summer of 1965, one reporter told President Lyndon Johnson the day after a bombing of North Vietnam, quote, "Mr. President, from what you have outlined as your program for now, it would seem that you feel that we can have guns and butter for the foreseeable future. Do you have any idea right now, though, that down the road, a piece of the American people may have to face the problem of guns or butter?" LBJ said that the American people would be willing to bear the burden. He said, quote, "I have not the slightest doubt, but whatever it is necessary to face, the American people will face," he responded. Now, he was wrong, of course, and the runaway inflation produced by the war spending broke the back of the New Deal coalition, shattering organized labor and ushering in neoliberalism and the Reagan Revolution. But according to Harris, not only could the American people have both guns and butter, they already had it, and it's good. Democrats, as they hunt for the culprit that cost them the election, are getting some of it right. Dramatically expanding the social safety net at the beginning of Biden's term, letting people know that a better world actually is possible, and then letting it all lapse as prices stayed high, turned out to be a political handicap. Then, instead of attacking the price hikes as the rotten fruit of greedy CEOs with too much economic and political power, the White House shot down the entire notion of greedflation. which has since confirmed as a driving factor in those price increases. And instead, they outsourced the fight against inflation to a Republican Fed chair who jacked up rates and with it the cost of mortgages and rent. Also, even James Carville says that maybe Bernie Sanders had a point.
I think Senator Sanders has some of a point here. And that is, there were things we could have run on harder that have effect. The minimum wage. It passes everywhere by 70%. I mean, I know that President Biden was for it and Harris was for it, but we didn't put it front and center.
Democrats are also blaming wokeness, whether it's trans girls playing girls' sports or the word Latinx, or generally the rise of a more dogmatic approach to identity politics that became popular on the left over the past decade. Now, I don't think they're actually wrong to examine that dogmatism. And I wrote a widely read piece in 2022 on how the phenomenon was destroying progressive institutions while a culture of fear and silence reigned. But it misses a key factor. In order to fend off the rise of economic populism in the form of Bernie Sanders in 2016, it was those same party leaders themselves who turned to identity politics, portraying themselves as the true champions of progressive values and deriding Sanders as a single-issue candidate, that issue being the economy. Here's Hillary Clinton going after Bernie Sanders.
Everything is about an economic theory, right? If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, and I will, if they deserve it, if they pose any systemic risk, I will. Would that end racism? No. Would that end sexism? No. Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community?
Now, suffice to say, we did not break up the big banks, and we did not end racism. Now, my book, The Squad, goes over this chapter in painful detail, so I won't belabor it here. But now that Democrats have lost again, it's the very same identity politics they are blaming. It's an impressive two-step. In 2016, cynical wokeness was wielded to fend off a challenge to corporate power. Now wokeness is being thrown overboard to save the Democratic Party elite from a deeper critique of their failure. But there's a more fundamental issue Democrats are ignoring, the one brought up by the first caller to Charlemagne. By continuing to think of American foreign policy and American domestic policy as distinct, the former the purview of experts in Washington and the latter the concern of regular people, rather than thinking of those things in tension, Democrats are missing the way that their shift into a more war-happy party is alienating them from voters and fueling the perception that they have no intention of addressing people's needs. It's apparently easy to forget that the working class drift away from Democrats that was underway in the 1980s and 1990s was reversed in 2008 by Barack Obama, who ran as an anti-war candidate against a party shredded by its spearheading of the disastrous invasion of Iraq. 8 years later, Trump bested Bush's brother and every other Republican contender this way.
On Monday, George W. Bush will campaign in South Carolina for his brother. As you said tonight, and you've often said, the Iraq War and your opposition to it was a sign of your good judgment. In 2008, in an interview with Wolf Blitzer talking about President George W. Bush's conduct of the war, you said you were surprised that Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi didn't try to impeach him. You said, quote, which personally I think would have been a wonderful thing, close quote. When you were asked what you meant by that, you said, for the war. For the war. He lied. He got us into the war with lies. Do you still believe President Bush should have been impeached?
First of all, I have to say, as a businessman, I get along with everybody. I have business all over the world. I know so many of the people in the audience. And by the way, I'm a self-funder. I have my wife and I have my son. That's all I have. I don't have this. So let me just tell you, I get along with everybody, which is my obligation to my company, to myself, etc. Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right? Now, you can take it any way you want, and it took Jeb Bush, if you remember at the beginning of his announcement, when he announced for president, took him 5 days. He went back. It was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Took him 5 days before his people told him what to say, and he ultimately said it was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty.
And he also beat Hillary Clinton by portraying himself in the same way as having opposed Bush's war.
Mr. Trump, with a lot of these are judgment questions. You had supported the war in Iraq before the invasion. What makes your judgment?
I did not support the war in Iraq.
2002.
That is a mainstream media nonsense put out by her.
Now, when liberals see America first, they read it as xenophobic and anti-immigrant. But Trump's supporters scan it as a promise not to waste money on wars and nation building while our own country crumbles. But the critique in that slogan, and expressed by that Charlemagne caller, makes an emotional link between issues that are treated as disparate and distinct by political operatives. The jarring price swings at the grocery store and at the pump, combined with the out-of-control wars and the surge of migrants at the border, combined to produce a visceral sense that our leaders in Washington were sacrificing the needs of regular people here in the United States. People's sense that the economy was being handled poorly by Biden was colored by the chaos overseas, and his rapt attention to Ukraine and Israel left little room for confidence that he cared what was going on back here. By pretending that the U.S. could do it all, but then only delivering on the foreign wars, Democrats set up ordinary people to view it as a zero-sum competition. When Harris says, quote, "we can do it all and we do," she is offering a version of conventional wisdom in Washington, which loves to point out, whenever people raise complaints like this, that wars are paid for out of different accounts than schools, or that much of what we're sending to Ukraine is in the form of weapons, not cash, which means we then get to make new weapons and everybody gets even richer. But even if that's true, most people don't consider themselves inside the we that's benefiting from all that. We just see money going towards war and our bills getting harder to pay. Think about how the overseas conflicts and the chaotic economy interacted with each other over the last 4 years. Now, one of Biden's most courageous moves, in my opinion, as president, was going through with the withdrawal from Afghanistan in the face of fierce military and media opposition. It wound up costing him badly. 13 U.S. service members were killed amid the retreat, and the airwaves were filled with the images of Afghans fatally swarming American cargo planes. It was chaos, and Biden never recovered from that. Now, that chaos, which played on repeat, hit just as prices were rising and the COVID-19 pandemic was easing. People were tentatively emerging from lockdown, and crime surged, which in many people's minds merged with and was blamed on the George Floyd protests from the year before, many of which had turned into riots. Now, kids who'd spent more than a year out of school never recovered. Then in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Biden assiduously resisted a negotiated end to the conflict. In June, the conservative justices on the Supreme Court undid generations of precedent and overturned Roe v. Wade. The war in Ukraine raged on as the body count piled up and the U.S. shoveled ever greater sums of money into the trenches. Wheat and energy prices fluctuated wildly. Prices eventually began rising at a slightly lower rate, but they rose nevertheless, and the response of the Fed to continuously raise interest rates and keep them high arguably contributed to the problem, raising the price of mortgages and rent. The migration surge at the border became too great to ignore. That, too, had a foreign policy link. U.S. foreign policy in general has produced an unstable hemisphere with heavy out-migration flows to the United States. During his time in office, Biden tightened sanctions and penalties on Cuba and Venezuela and intervened to fuel chaos in Haiti. The three countries combined sent the bulk of migrants at key moments. Then came October 7th and the horrifying images it produced. Weeks of a relentless and indiscriminate Israeli response turned into months. Biden and his administration took a public posture that the U.S. wanted a ceasefire, yet the attack only ratcheted it up. As the death count reached shocking numbers and U.S. weapons and financing went up with it, Biden's stated goal was to contain the conflict, unquote. But it periodically broke out into regional war. Shipping was effectively halted, and in October, Netanyahu, with the aim of defeating Biden, launched assaults on Lebanon and Iran, which launched their own assaults in retaliation. And the Ukraine war, with its ever-present threat of nuclear catastrophe, grinds on. Does that sound like we can do it all? So I think if, Emily, as you think back over the last 4 years, you can imagine why, when confronted with Trump versus the status quo, people are like, well, what I liked about Trump was that wages were going up, prices were pretty flat, and we didn't have a whole bunch of wars going on. Mm-hmm. What I didn't like about Trump was that he's an unpredictable madman, kind of a lunatic personally. But if your alternative is all of these wars breaking out around the world and no certainty about prices and the economy here at home,
Immigration.
then you're like, you know what, I'll take that.
Right.
In hindsight. So I think the good news for Democrats is that if they want to make a comeback, just stop doing all the wars. That's a big step in the right direction.
And I mean, even just changing, like I hope they don't do this because I think it's cynical, but it's so telling that they don't even frame the wars in a way that is a pitch to the American people outside of Washington and New York. I think Joe Rogan recently was replaying this clip of Tucker Carlson confronting Mike Pence when Pence was running for president in the primary about how he sees all of this decay in America and wants to keep sending weapons and resources to Ukraine that could be spent on Americans. And Pence says almost exactly what you said at the last part there. Of course, the opposite. He says, we can do it both. Anyone who tells you we can't do it both, we can't be the policeman of the world and take care of our own people, has a very small-minded vision of the United States. But it's not a small-minded vision of the United States. It's exactly what's happening. And Democrats are incapable of responding to what Trump taps into, which is telling people exactly that, saying we are not doing it both right now. We cannot have it all right now until we start cracking down on this adventurism abroad and until we start treating immigration like it does have economic implications for people. We can debate what they are, but Democrats don't even talk about it. Don't even talk about it in economic framing unless it's to say it's making us all better.
All right, well, that'll do it for us today.
That was so interesting.
Enjoy your Thanksgiving. Well, thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
And you'll be in Vermont for Thanksgiving?
I think we're going to go to Vermont for Thanksgiving. Yeah, maybe do a little skiing if it snows, hopefully.
Whoa, all right.
Yeah.
That'll be a lot of fun. I'll be back here with Crystal Saugers, headed off to Japan on his honeymoon. So Crystal and I will be holding down the Fort Worth Girls shows tomorrow, Monday, and Tuesday.
Wonderful. All right, see you guys soon.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.